Good evening, and thank you for joining us on a nice sunny afternoon. It's a windowless lecture theatre, but hopefully it'll keep you nice and cool. Just like to say thank you very much, my name is Clem Silverman. I'm from the London International Development Centre, which coordinates interdisciplinary research across the 5 Bloomsbury colleges, if you weren't already familiar with us. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Malcolm Potts here today, who is a reproductive scientist and professor of public health at the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. He's a Cambridge-trained obstetrician and reproductive scientist, and has been working internationally since the 1960s. He's co-director of the Berkeley International Group with Dr. Julia Walsh. And whilst he was first medical director of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, for a decade he introduced family planning methods in scores of developing countries. And as CEO of the Family Health International, he launched the first scale studies of maternal mortality, which helped start the worldwide Safe Motherhood Initiative. And he's published many tens of books and hundreds of scientific papers. And I'll let Malcolm tell you a little bit more about his connection to the local area. So please welcome him.
Well, thank you very much. I feel very much I'm among friends. I hope the microphones are working. Gower Street is very important in my life. I was a medical student at UCH. My eldest son was born in the obstetric hospital there. My youngest son is on the faculty at University College next door. My wife, who's with me, Martha Campbell, gave a landmark speech in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, I think about 2005, on why the silence in population, which is something I'll be talking about. And that led to a friendship with an all-party parliamentary group on family planning and population development, and a long-term friendship with Richard Ottaway, now Sir Richard Ottaway, who's a leader in this field. Also, I was the first male doctor at the Murray Stopes Clinic, and they introduced intrauterine devices there, and I introduced vasectomies there. And I was a fellow of Cambridge College. I used to sneak away once a week, drive to Audley End in my car, and come on the train and do these things and then rush back again. So that was part of my life. And my most important colleague at Berkeley is a wonderful lady called Andola Plata. She's an Angolan physician, and her MSc is from here. So there's many links. Let me start with my takeaway messages. I think that global public health is going to be dominated by demographic changes in the second part of this century, and the most acute and approaching crisis will be that in the Sahel. I think there's going to be huge changes in the world, and my own sort of epiphany in thinking about this has been a realization that some of the threats which involve the least developed countries on this planet are so dire that they could actually reverse many of the great achievements we've had in reducing infant mortality, in reducing stunting, many of the things in the past 50 years, I think in the next 50 years, could be under threat unless we make some very important policy and financial investments. But there's also hope. I think there are evidence-based ways in which we could ameliorate these approaching catastrophes. And they have, I think, to offer much more emphasis on family planning we've had for some years. We have to do some large-scale things. So, if we look at the developed economies in the world, we're 1.2 billion people today. We might be 1.3 billion people in 2100. If we look at the least developed economies, which are still a small part of the total population of the world, less than 1 million people, by 2100 they'll be the largest single population unit on this planet. And whether we look at the highest UN demographic projections or the lowest, they'll still be the largest group of people. And unless some very important changes take place, then...
Sorry, can everyone hear okay?
Okay. No, if people can't hear, it's important to interrupt.
Yes, try that one.
Hello? No? Hello?
1, 2. That's it seems to be more.
Okay.
Good.
Can I just interrupt us? Can you hear? Good. Okay. So, you know, human beings weren't evolved to think about very large numbers. And it's very difficult getting your mind around a million, let alone a billion people. I'm always quoting a study by a man called Slovik in the University of Oregon. And he took a nice representative of Americans, and he told them a story about a child in Africa. He gave this child a name, he showed the little girl's photograph, and he said to the people, "This child is hungry." And then he asked them how much they would donate on average to this hungry child. And they said about £1.20p, you know, $2 basically. And then he told exactly the same story, but said, by the way, he had the same photograph, the same story, the same name, another random sample of people. By the way, there's 1 million other hungry children, and people gave less. And they just gave the statistics, they gave least. So we really sort of primed to think about individuals, to be empathetic towards individuals, but we find it very difficult to get our brain around these very large numbers. So perhaps one way of doing it is to think that every minute there are 165 more births than deaths in the developing world, and the largest number of those are in many of the least developed countries, and there's only 3 in the developed countries. So this sort of exponential growth that's taking place has some very important implications. So let's look at the Sahel. I love this picture. How the hell do you get a camera into a car? But in a way, I think it captures this part of the world, which has some modern things happening in it, but also some very traditional things, very patriarchal societies, very early marriage, often very corrupt governments, very poor infrastructure. I don't know many Arabic words, but Sahel is the Arabic for shore, in this case the shore of the Sahara Desert. I think it's a pity that these bits are green, they should really be very yellow, you can see them maybe on the satellite picture. So we're talking about this area which dips down to northern Nigeria, and I'll be talking about work that we're doing in that area. But this is the iconic picture which I hope you'll take away with you, because it really has some very, very sinister implications. So if we look at the UN population statistics on the Sahel, in 1950 there were 30 million people, and this is defining the Sahel ecologically as that vulnerable semi-arid area below the desert from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Today there are 125 million people. And in 2050, which isn't all that far away, there'll be more people than live in the United States. There'll be a tripling of the population. And the UN projection for 2100 is a totally impossible one. This is the rise in temperature that's been recorded so far. And this is the projection with the confidence intervals prepared by a colleague of mine at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, who has a supercomputer. He runs it for hours at a time and does these projections. So when I began to look at the demography of this area, I nearly fell off my chair. When Michael Wayner looked at the climate, he nearly fell off his chair. And what this really tells us is that in the middle of this century, more people than live in the United States of America are going to watch their crops wither and their cattle die. This is a potential mega humanitarian disaster, and it's an unambiguous disaster, because first of all, a lot of the mothers of children that are going to be born themselves are already born. So if we look at Niger, the total fertility rate, the average is 7.6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is my half chart. But you know, this is the average. There's many people having 10 or 12 children. There's some of the people in this room who have worked in Mali, in Burkina, and Niger. And this is something that cannot continue. So these are population pyramids to the same scale. And you can hardly see the population of Niger in 1950. It's a bit bigger today, but by 2050, it's really impossible to imagine that group of people. They will not be able to live in that area because of the rising temperatures. It's just going to become desertified. So, you know, and there's no mistakes in these projections. Even if we take the lowest UN projections and assume a fairly rapid decline in fertility, which I'm presently showing is unlikely, we've still got a very serious problem. And if we look at this one is telling you how many people could die. This is what makes me think that we could be reversing many of the changes, the achievements in global public health for the last 50 years, because this cannot occur. So the UN is well known for its diplomacy and gentle words. Very rarely does it talk about environmental disasters, and I've never seen a UN document that says mission impossible. These are sober UN documents looking at what is happening in this area. We've all seen this kind of picture, and the horrible, viscerally disturbing exploitation of people that takes place from a failed state, Libya, trying to get across the Mediterranean, significant numbers of people dying. And the largest number of these people are ecological refugees already. So, but this is a trickle of sadness compared to the tsunami that is going to overtake this region within 2 or 3 decades. So the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification said there'd be 60 million people moving from the desertified areas of sub-Saharan Africa by 2020. I'm not quite as pessimistic as that, but I think there'll certainly be 60 million people moving by 2040 and 2050. These are huge numbers of people. So at the present moment, we've got a very, very small number of people, and there is no plausible way in which Europe could absorb those number of people. And again, there's going to be deaths and drowning. And embedded in those tens of millions of people, ultimately hundreds of millions of people, will be some very angry people who will adopt extremist policies and teaching. But already, you know, we've got, this is the worldwide report, and a lot of these displacement is from Syria, and there's bad things happening in the Middle East. But we're seeing very, very rapid increase in the number of refugees, and it's going to, I think, be the ecological refugees. They're also going to be driven by poverty, because there's no way in which the people in the Sahel are going to move, you know, to garment factories or anything like that. They're landlocked countries. Economic development is really not within their reach. Educations are going to keep up with the number of people. This is a very, very dire situation. This is the population of Niger to 2012 from 1960, from under 4 million to 18 million, and this, you will notice, is a geometrical curve. This is the growth in cereal production from 1960 to 2012, and you will notice that there's an arithmetical curve. And a certain person, whose name some of you may recognize, said, population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. A slight acquaintance with numbers will show the immensity of the first power in comparison to the second. I think that Thomas Malthus would probably be very sad to see this data, but he might say, perhaps I had a pretty good idea. In 2012, we organized a meeting, which was probably the first multidisciplinary meeting where we had colleagues from the Sahel, from academia, from governments, from climate change, from agriculture, from girls' education, and we called it OASIS, Organised into Advanced Solutions in the Sahel. We wanted a positive, round image. And my colleague Radio is in the back room, was at that meeting and made a great contribution. She's been working in Mali. And it was a very successful meeting in the sense that there was what I call an oh-wow factor. When you put the climate people and the population people and the education people together, they said, we've really got a huge problem. But we have to do a minimum of 3 things. We have to do something to roll back the age of marriage, and I'll focus on that in a moment. We have to do something to make family planning more accessible, and we have to do something to help people adapt as much as is possible to climate change. So these are the 3 things, and they need to be done quickly, and they need to be done on a large scale. And it's a 3-legged stool. If you take one of these things away, you're not going to get anywhere. So it's a very clear set of policies that I think most people will be able to buy into. So there are practical things you can do to help subsistence farmers and agriculturalists adapt to climate change. You can make little pits for putting humus and things in when you plant. There are things that can be done, and they should be done. You can build contours around hills to prevent erosion. I've seen that done very powerfully in Tigray in Ethiopia. You can do drip irrigation. Some of the women's groups are doing that. So that is something that we must do. We know a fair amount about. There is a significant unmet need for family planning in all these countries. And you know, the UN defines unmet need as a woman who is not using a modern contraceptive but says she never wants a child and doesn't want another one for 2 years. And in all these countries, there's more women who fall into that category than there are people currently using contraception. So in all my life, I felt that if you just start with a policy of meeting the unmet need for family planning, unmet need is a moving target in every country that I've ever been in, and so I think there are important things that can be done in family planning. We need policies like task shifting, and we need money. The really big challenge, and the one which I honestly thought we wouldn't be able to make any progress with, is how in a patriarchal society with child marriage, we could possibly roll back the age of marriage. This is data from northern Nigeria, ecologically and culturally it's part of the Sahel. It's a Hausa-speaking society. This is Emmanuel Bello University, our work at Berkeley. And we've been working now for about 8 years there. And when we started, there's been lots of efforts to keep girls in secondary school, and most of them to date have failed. This is an independent commission on aid by the UK, and no major improvement in learning. So I'm actually astonished and proud by what we've achieved. This is a series, these names are simply villages in where about 3,000 of the girls who we work with are living. And this is simply the number of girls enrolled in secondary school, and as the project has taken off, we've moved from about 4% of girls going to secondary school to about 70 or 80% going to secondary school, which I think is astonishing. And if there's time, I can explain why I think we've been able to do that. And we've put up the age of marriage. This is based on 3,000 girls. This is now the girls are beginning to graduate from secondary school. There's a lot entering for the first time, so we'll have a bigger effect. But we have shifted the age of marriage significantly, and we hope to see a bigger shift. And this is in an area where the mean age of marriage in our baseline survey was 14.9 years, which means a lot of 12-year-olds are getting married. One of the things that brought tears to our eyes was Malala, the wonderful Pakistani girl who was shot and got the Nobel Prize. earlier this year, she visited our girls, and there was this immediate rapport, because she comes from a child marriage Muslim society. It was very patriarchal, and so they immediately were working with each other. She gave us a foundation, gave us some money. But she did something that no other Nobel Prize winner has ever done since Nobel Prizes were invented in 1904, and that was to invite other people to stand beside her on the platform in Oslo. And she invited one of our girls from Nigeria, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So there is hope. And I think when you see this kind of success, it brings tears to your eyes, but also the figures are very, very somber. And I say where we're working, which is not on this chart, the mean age of marriage is 14.9. Now, just from basic demography, if you can raise the age of marriage in teenagers by 5 years, you can reduce the rate of population growth by 15 to 20% without doing anything else, without any contraceptives or anything else. You have this enormous impact. And secondly, I think common sense will tell us that if a girl's married, when she's 14 or 15, and has 2 or 3 children by the time she's 20, she's never really going to be able to manage her fertility. I think this is a non-negotiable thing. You have to raise the age of marriage in these societies. And you do it not by saying, there's something wrong with the society, but by very patiently, this is what we did with a medical demographer, to live in a village, learn the language. And it's not nice living in a village in northern Nigeria. It's dry and dusty and incredibly hot, and there's no air conditioning. But trying to assume, which I think is the basis of global public health, that people are sensible, people are savvy, they make valid decisions. So the assumption was that everybody knows education is important, but what are the constraints that are preventing these communities sending their girls to secondary school? And we found 2 things. One was the parents said, look, primary education is so incompetently graded in this area that our girls go to school, and our boys, for several years, and they can't read a sentence in Hausa, and they can't add 2 and 2 make 4 at the end of primary school. So people say, why on earth should we send our children to secondary school? Education doesn't work. And then they said, we know we're in a corrupt country, we know we have to pay bribes, but we can't afford the $10 twice a year that the education system expects. So we said, okay, if we pay the $10 with your daughter to go to school. And they said, don't give us the $10, give the $10 directly to the school. And it's those 2 things. We started giving primary school children 2 hours a week with older women mentors, teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic. And the second hour was, what is menstruation, what's going to happen when they get a bit older. And that mentoring, plus the basically paying the bribes, has really unlocked this in a quite remarkable way. But I think we have to really put family planning back center stage. We've got to change our paradigms. I've had my 80th birthday recently. When I started in this field, there was a huge sort of awareness that rapid population growth was a problem. And there were very modest sums of money that went into family planning from the UK, from the Americans, from the Swedes, from Rockefeller and Ford, and really had an extraordinary success in places like South Korea and Taiwan and Thailand and Sri Lanka and Colombia and a million places that I've worked. And I've seen that happen. I've seen total fertility rates come down from 6 to 1.8 in a number of decades. And then in 1994, there's been or was before that, International Population Development Conference every 10 years. The Cairo one's often spoken about, but it had some very noble ideas and a broad range of things that people wanted to do, all of which reasonable people could buy into to make life better and give women more autonomy. But it was done in a way that took the focus off family planning, the budgets collapsed, and part of the demographic momentum we see in Africa is the result of taking the focus off family planning. So the current paradigm still among a lot of World Bank people, a lot of people making decisions about investments and decisions about how to help the Sahel and other low-resource, least developed countries has been that if you have socio-economic development, if people get richer and better educated, they will have fewer children. But in the least developed countries, there's only one, and there's about 30, I think. That list was put together in the 1960s. It was defined by a lot of things, including low status of women. There's only been one country with 1 million people that's graduated to be a developed country. Well, not a developed, but a developing country. I should say developing, I'm sorry. And over time, a huge amount of money has been put into trying to move into socio-economic development. But it hasn't worked. The population's grown faster than the education can keep up with it. We've not lifted people out of poverty. There has been in Africa some, in the MDGs, some decline in the percentage of people below the poverty line. But the absolute number of people has increased because there's rapid population growth. And yet over this last decade, only 0.31% of foreign aid has gone into family planning. This is crazy and needs to change. We had a meeting of most of the world's leading demographers, including John Cleveland from here, John Bongard from the United States, Wolfgang Lutz from Austria. And we looked at the demography of the world in 2050, and we published in the Phil Trans, the Royal Society. Incidentally, another thing like our street, didn't Charles Darwin live here for a while? My great hero. So, and Darwin published obviously in Phil Trans. But this meeting came to a number of statements which I think everybody bought into. And one of them is that there's a lot of unintended pregnancies. In fact, we live in a world where there are about 85 million more births and deaths each year, which is what's driving population growth, but also about that number of unplanned pregnancies. But what this group said was that ready access to contraception, safe abortion, has increased family size, even in illiterate communities living on less than $1 a day. And that's very important, because everybody wants people to be better educated and more wealthy. But when you can't do that, you can still help people by making family planning available. Indira Gandhi made the horrible mistake of saying we had to give people incentives to have fewer children, and led to a brief but inexcusable episode of coercion in India. But she was an Oxford-educated person. She had the standard demographic transition paradigm. She'd been taught that people had to be richer and better educated before they would have smaller families. She was an intelligent woman. She said, we're not going to be able to educate people in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. They're not going to get richer. Therefore, we must give them incentives. And that's what degraded very rapidly into a horrible episode of coercion. Because she had the wrong paradigm. The paradigm is that if you respect people and give them choices, then fertility falls. And so, it's a similar statement. And so there's been a huge difference in the rate of which countries have gone through. This is taking the demographic transition from 6 to 3.5. It took America 58 years to make that transition. Indonesia did it in just over 20 years. Colombia more rapidly. Thailand, where I worked a lot and saw what was happening, did it in 8 years. China did it in 7 years, and the most rapid one of all was the Islamic Republic of Iran. Isn't that remarkable? Simply because the economists, the demographers, the public health people went to Ayatollah Khomeini and said, we're an oil-rich country, but we've got a problem. We're not going to be able to educate and employ our younger people at the rate at which they're coming along. Can we do family planning? And Ayatollah Khomeini thought about this and really said, and he was obviously an outstanding Islamic theologian, he said, yes, you can do family planning, but you must have the permission of the wife, which is not our usual way that we tend to think about Iran. And then the technicians, they made the only condom factory in Islam, they made a pill factory, Last time I was in Iran, I was driving along, and there's a building, and there's a neon sign about twice as long as this paper. And I don't read Farsi, but they said that's vasectomy clinic. They've got over the problems of which some Islamic countries have of saying that sterilization is a mutilation. So, and these are profound differences. And America in the 19th century was getting better educated. People were getting richer, but that they didn't have access to family planning. Or look at these two countries, both of which I worked in and I know very well, where you have a fairly realistic, efficient family planning program as we created in Bangladesh, then the richest economic quintile have about 2 kids, and the poorest one have about 1 kid more, but there's not all that difference. When you have a country like the Philippines, where the church makes it difficult to get family planning, then the rich people do what they always do. They can buy what they need, they can buy a safe abortion. If you're rich, you can get what fertility you want, but the poor are the ones that keep on having children, and they're having 5 children. And I think this kind of difference between those countries that have what I call good family planning and bad family planning is very important. So a lot of people don't realize how many barriers there are to making contraception available. I was actually surprised in some parts of Africa, women never use a contraceptive because they're often not there, they're over-medicalized, they have stupid rules, like you wouldn't do family planning unless the woman's menstruating. You can perfectly well know whether a woman's pregnant or not. Women are pretty savvy, you can't get there. And there's a huge amount of misinformation. So one of the things we've been doing in Andrella Prada with our MSc from here has been teaching village volunteers in Ethiopia to give the popular injectable contraceptive. The rules in in every other country in Africa and every other part of Ethiopia are you must be a doctor or a nurse to give this popular injection. There aren't doctors and nurses in the right places, and if there are, they're pretty busy doing more important things. You can train people to give a safe injection into the deltoid. These people are very proud of what they're doing. They know their own community. We have 2 priests giving injections, and we're trying to make this financially self-sufficient. There's also a lot of misinformation. It's a study I did many years ago in FHI. We went to a lot of countries. We asked a random selection of people a simple question: is taking an oral contraceptive more or less dangerous than having a baby? And in some African countries, like Senegal, there's more people who think the pill's more dangerous than having a baby. Where we work in northern Nigeria, there's a lifetime risk of 1 in 12 of dying in childbirth. High fertility and a horrible maternal mortality rate. The studies from this country show that women who take the pill actually live slightly longer than women who don't take it, and it significantly reduces 3 important cancers. But if this is what you believe, then you are very sensible not to take the pill. So what happened after Cairo is that the budgets for family planning, the blue bars, really collapsed. They're beginning to come back a little bit now, but not very much. Whereas those firstly control and AIDS went through the roof. And people never asked what we were buying. And family planning is not a cost, it's an investment. Very quickly, within 5 years or so, you recover the cost of family planning in not having unintended pregnancies, not having to treat women for unsafe abortions, having less vaccination, etc. It's an investment. And yet, this terrible figure again, this is from a paper that Population Matters has put together, which I think is just incredibly, if we think of numbers, and we think of the rapid population growth in this area, and this total disjunction, this thing that has no relationship to whatever to people's needs and how we might help women. So what happened if we look at a country like Kenya is that when budgets collapsed after Cairo, a moderately successful, perfectly voluntary family planning program that brought fertility rate down from 8 to 5, and it stalled, and then it went up again. There'll be 12 million more people in Kenya because we took the focus off family planning, because we took the budgets away, because people did other things. when I first went to Kenya, there were 12 million people in the whole country. 12 million people in 2050 could potentially turn this into a failed state. So a lot of people make sort of ex-cathedra statements about family planning and about other people, which I always find very curious. Most of us in this room are heterosexuals, most of us had sex or will have sex. We know what it involves, and it's crazy. I find this really terribly insulting to say that impoverished families choose to have lots of children. Jeffrey Sachs has never been in a hospital and seen women 3 in a bed suffering and dying from unsafe abortions. He doesn't know that there are 12 million unsafe abortions in Africa every year. He doesn't know that there are 26,000 women who die every year from unsafe abortions. I'm at Berkeley. There are 26,000 students at Berkeley. When I cross the campus, it brings tears to my eyes, because these are young, vibrant, wonderful people. They're roughly the same age group and the same potential of the women that are dying in Africa to prove they don't want to have a child. And to say people to have choose, and that statistically they overcompensate. That is, if you'll excuse the word, bullshit. We wrote a paper, Martha and I, called Do Economists Have Frequent Sex? Because this really should be our starting point of thinking about the regulation of human fertility. So, we're a strange animal. I mean, rabbits could, if there was a Vatican for rabbits, it would be very easy to use the rhythm method, because they only have sex when the females ovulate. We have sex a lot of times. We're a funny primate. And so this is, countries, whether we're countries 10 times as rich as another one, we all have sex at roughly the same rate. And so unless you have the information and means to separate frequent sex from childbearing, you have a lot of kids. The default position for human beings is a large family. And here is a woman who had a large family. The richest, best educated woman in England, who we know had a very happy sex life, and who was furious when she had a second, third, fourth, and sixth child. She thought children were disgusting, that's the word she used. She didn't want those children. But she had a normal sex life, and they kept on coming, and she'd had more if Albert hadn't died of cholera from dirty drains in Windsor Castle. So whether you're in Buckingham Palace or Burkina Faso, you will have a lot of kids, unless you have the means and knowledge to separate sex from childbearing. Bill Gates has this assertion which a lot of people buy into. And in that first newsletter, he had this chart. So here is the birth rate per thousand for a number of countries in Latin America. Most of these are in Latin America and Asia. And here's the infant mortality coming down, and here's the birth rate coming down. There are like reasonable correlations. So this is infant mortality fall, this is birth rate fall, TFR fall. But not all correlations are causal. And he cherry-picked his data. So here is the data from Asia. This is the data that he was using. Declining infant mortality, declining total fertility rate. This is the data from Burkina, Chad, and Niger. Decline, significant and welcome declines in infant mortality. No change in total fertility rate. Because people don't have access to family planning. So if we look at rising contraceptive prevalence rates, which I think is a very useful metric, in Asia we've had great success with modest inputs. In Africa, very little's happening. Here's Chad, nothing else. One way of looking at this is to ask a question, and this is calculations that are fairly simple to do. If the date when a country might achieve replacement level fertility has a huge impact on the total final population. So here's Niger again. If Niger was to have 2.1 children by 2020, or probably with a high infant mortality of 2.2, they would still go from 18 million to just under, they would still double their population. Now, there's absolutely no way that they could possibly reach that. But if they did that by 2040, which I think would be or 2060, which would be pretty optimistic, they'll have 80 million people. And if they don't do it till 2080, they have over 100 million people. So it really drives home what demographic momentum implies and why we need to act very quickly. Another way of looking at this is a calculation we did. Ethiopia, I think, is the model for Africa in increasing contraceptive prevalence. It's increasing by over 2% a year, and I think that's achievable in most countries. And if they continue to do that, then they'll just about double their population over a century. Niger, until recently, was going up by 0.05 percentage points per year. And if they continue to do that, business as usual, they have an impossible 500 million people. Now, Niger, credit to them, the president has set some pretty ambitious goals for raising the contraceptive prevalence, but it's going to take time and money to get those put into place. Let me move, because I want much time for questions. I think it is questionable that the world can feed 9 billion people with global warming. We already have a lot of hungry people. We have loss of soil, which is very difficult, we can't replace. We've got falling water levels. If the Himalayan glaciers melt, which is on the cards, we're going to have a lot of hungry people in Asia. So, and we certainly know, my agricultural colleagues tell me that rising temperature in the Sahel begins by cutting crop fields. So when Norman Borlaug got his well-deserved Nobel Prize for the Green Revolution, his last paragraph in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize is to say, we've got we've got some time, but we have to look at population. He talks about population control, which is perhaps a word that's become a bit dirty, but I mean, we were certainly talking about voluntary family planning, and we need a common effort. And people didn't really listen to him. Let me make some final comments on why I think the pill is mightier than the sword. I rather like, we wrote an op-ed in the San Francisco Journal, and they did this, I think, rather nice cartoon. The 9/11 Commission says this, that and this is not only for Muslim populations, this is for any population in the world, where you have a large, steadily increasing population of young men without any reasonable expectation to suitable or steady employment is a sure prescription for social determinants. I think that is totally true. I used Queen Victoria as an N of 1. This is a very large statistic, which is almost too good to be true, or whatever you know, but statistically it's very, very compelling. After World War II, you had a bump in the birth rate, a bulge of babies that were being born. As those passed through different age groups, when the American population, when the age group 15 to 29 was at its maximum level in relation to the total population, the murder rate was also at its maximum level. And there's quite a good correlation between the percentage of young people in a population and the likelihood of conflict. It's not, you don't have to have conflict, but there is a correlation here. And so anything that we can do which will slow population growth will make the world a more peaceful as well as a more prosperous place. So this is the choice that is before us. These are the UN statistics. And the really impressive thing here is that the median variance is between 10 and 11 billion people. Of those, the largest single group would be the least developed countries. If everybody was to have half a child less, it would be 3 billion people, and that might be a sustainable world. If they have half a child more, which is the way we're going at present, you'd have between 16 and 17 billion people, which I think any reasonable person with some degree of common sense would realize is totally unsustainable. The existential question for the younger people in this room is, are we going to be able to move the world to a biologically sustainable economy by the end of this century, or will we irreversibly degrade the biosphere on which we all depend? You are the first generation to face that problem, and you're the last generation that can possibly solve it. And in that solution, population not the only thing but it's one essential factor. And unless we put it center stage, a lot of bad things are going to happen. There'll be huge suffering for a lot of wonderful people in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Chad, in Mali, and there'll be a lot of threats and problems to our own world. And those are things that I think we have to think about, and I thank you for your time, and I hope we can have some questions and discussion. Yes.
Do you think some sort of journalistic approach might also be at hand to kind of ease in the transition to family planning, but also maybe setting a quota that is mathematically sustainable to limit the population? Do you think that's a viable option?
Here, the question is about should we be setting targets that would be biologically sustainable. I wouldn't do that. Intellectually, I would look at that question because I think it's a very valid one. Policy-wise, I wouldn't do it. First of all, I don't think we need to do it. Even if we had, some dictator in Burkina Faso who said everybody has 4 children tomorrow, there's no way that that could possibly be enforced. I think we have to go back to rely on decisions that women make, get rid of the misinformation, make things as accessible as possible, respect people and give them choices. It's very late and there's going to be a lot of difficulties, but I don't see any other policy, and it is the most humane policy. But I also, and that's what I've been trying to share with you, have an intellectual picture of what is unsustainable. And we have that. And I think our response should not be tell people how many children to have. Our response should be pour billions of dollars into girls' education, which in relation to defense is trivial, and hundreds of millions of dollars into family planning, be prepared to waste some of it, get moving there. That's what I would do. Yeah.
I don't want to quarrel with your argument as a whole, because I agree with it, but I do want to challenge you really on your remarks on infant and child mortality, because I think we need to draw the distinction between necessary and sufficient causes. And clearly, if Bill Gates was arguing that infant and child mortality decline was a sufficient cause of fertility decline, he was wrong. But it may very well be a necessary cause. And that's important because compared with 1994, infant and child mortality is very much lower, including in the Sahel. And therefore, the response to additional resources put into family planning might be much greater now.
It's possible. It's a very difficult topic to study because we've had infant mortality decline in practically anywhere. We don't have any control groups really. Fortunately, I think bringing infant mortality down is done fairly good. But in the country in which I'm now standing, the United Kingdom, our birth rate takes a dip in 1877. Infant mortality goes on horizontally to about 1900, then it goes down. What happened in 1877 is the famous Bradlaugh-Besant trial, and it was put on trial for republishing Knowlton's book on family planning. And as people said, it put family planning on the breakfast table of everybody in the country because it was a very well reported, very controversial issue about should people have access to family planning. So, anybody's going to disagree with it. It's very important to bring infant mortality down. But it also should give us more leverage also to give people the choices they need so they have fewer children. Because just having a lot of children who are then going to die or kill each other in 20 years' time, which is what we're really talking about here, it seems to me is not ethical. Yes?
Thanks. Wondering if you could touch on it already, but same thing more about the desired family size in the Sahel region, whether it differs to other areas of the world. So I know, and sort of, is there an economic incentive, to have a smaller family, or is it the whole story of having a larger family?
It's a very good question. Well, when I first went to Bangladesh, people were having 6 children. I honestly never met a single person who said they wanted to have 2 children. There were a lot of people who said, well, 4 or 5 might be sufficient. And then when you got to 4 or 5, people said, oh, perhaps 3 is interesting. Or somebody in the village has got 3 children and going to school. So I think there's a lot of very solid data that desired family size is a moving target. Now, Niger is the only country in the world where the desired family size on surveys is even higher than the 7.6 total fertility rate. But it's also a very high desired family size in Burkina Faso. But a recent study by the Guttmacher Institute said there were 200,000 unsafe abortions in Burkina each year. So I think that there's some low-hanging fruit we can go after, and that as we do that, I think more and more people will join in. And again, I think that's the sort of policy. But again, in a polygamous society, some of the women are competing for how many children they can have by the same man, and it is a society with traditionally very large families. But again, people are not stupid. People are saying, in one village, they were talking to a journalist, and they said, 20 years ago, there were trees between where you're standing and the mosque. Now all the trees have been cut down for firewood. They see that they're just degrading their environment, and they see in the plots of land getting smaller. So I think, that there could be an impressive rate of fertility decline if we made the policy shift to task shift, allow volunteers to give injections and things like that. If we really had the courage to change to switch from dangerous abortions to safe abortions, that would do 2 things. I've known a lot of illegal abortionists. I've never known one who gives contraceptive advice to the woman who's had an abortion. As a physician who's done abortions, I think I'm ethically obliged to give every woman I offer a safe abortion contraceptive advice. And so you get a much more realistic and rapid decline of fertility if you see family planning as contraception and abortion. That would be a huge policy leap for Francophone Africa. But, it might take place in 10 or 15 years. Yes?
Where do the unsafe abortions tend to take place? In urban environments or rural?
Really, everywhere, and really I might know more about that question. And there's a variety of people who do unsafe abortions. Some are women who've had an abortion, learned how to do it. Some are midwives who want to help other women. Some are men who want to help other women. Some are incredibly exploitive. Alicia, my first PhD student at Berkeley studied unsafe abortion in Ethiopia. And she asked the women many questions, including, how much did you pay the abortionist? And then she also asked them, 9% of the women not only had to give quite a lot of money, but they had to give sex as well. And I suspect it's more than 9%, because that's such a viscerally disturbing thing, but it does illustrate how when a woman wants to end a pregnancy, she's willing to risk her life. And the really bad exploitive abortionists know that, and they're going to have sex. And these things are just so ugly. And 26,000 basically young women dying, I think, is unacceptable. And I know enough about abortion to know I could prevent 20,000 of those deaths next year if you change your abortion laws. Yes?
Today in Burkina Faso or in Africa, what's the situation like in terms of stigma for women that do get abortions?
I think it's quite high. And also abortions may be underreported for that reason. Demography student at Berkeley did a study of this about American women. She said, who do you tell when you've had an abortion that's safe and legal in America? And you talk to your sister and your cousin if you think they approve, and you don't tell your brother if you think he disapproves. So the right to lifers live in a fantasy world where they're not actually exposed to how many abortions there are even in their own family. So there is stigma, and I think it's a difficult, it's understandable. And on the other hand, studies show that 95% of people who have a safe abortion, looking back on it, say I made the right decision. And it can be, particularly early on, a very simple procedure. Now we have medical abortion, just with misoprostol, we could make safe abortion available even in these very low resource setting corrupt country like Chad. Perhaps Chad would be a good place. It's so corrupt, perhaps you could bribe somebody.
Oh yeah, thanks for your interesting chat. Just going back to something you said earlier about ecological refugees being the largest number across in the Mediterranean. I just wonder how you came to that conclusion.
It may not be the most academic thing. There was a long article in Huffington Post a few weeks ago that was quoting figures about that. And they may not be wrong. And I think when you've got a totally a failed state like Libya, then it's probably, we don't know accurately, but a significant number. If you just look at the pictures of people on the boat, they don't look to me like, some of them are Syrians, but they're coming by different groups.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a large number of Eritreans, and there's also big other issues going on in Eritrea.
And probably some Yemenis.
Same for Mali, Nigeria. I think it's difficult to isolate environmental and population pressure.
And I would agree with that, and I think a lot of the present surge in refugees is driven by conflict, and I think there's no doubt about that. But even the conflict in Syria, again, nothing as complicated as the conflict has a single explanation. But there was a drought. Assad's group could afford to dig their wells deeper. Most people couldn't. A lot of young men left the farms because they were drying up. They went to the cities. They didn't find employment, and they didn't become extremists, but they joined the Arab Spring and they were challenging Assad. And so, one factor in the terrible things happening in Syria and Iraq was a drought, and total fertility rate probably 3 or something like that, between 3 and 4, I think. And I'm focusing on Sahel because that seems to me the data is unambiguous, and we're beginning to see really bad things happening. There are a lot of other places where global warming is going to be a very serious threat. Asia on a very big scale. If I was saying to my wife, it's so nice being in London, I don't feel guilty brushing my teeth, because I live in California, and we've got the 5th year really quite a serious drought, a really serious drought. So the climate is changing, and in the Sahel there may be more precipitation, curiously enough, but it will come as flash floods. So you'll have a higher temperature, and it will literally evaporate before the water can get into the ground. But I think all reasonable people accept that significant global warming is taking place, and that the projections for the future are really very somber. I don't think it's going to be very difficult to keep it below the 2 °C goal that people want. And so population and family planning, I think, come together. Population and climate change are colliding in many parts of the world. The place where the threat is most unambiguous is the Sahel, and that's a place also where I think we need to be making large-scale urgent action. Yes.
I mean, looking at that graph you've given us there, I mean, it's a scary prospect, especially when you see where we are today. How do you feel we can influence change in a way that's clearly going to the green curve, but looking at it from a global position, do you feel that we in the West have a major role to play in changing that curve, and what would that be?
I think we have in 2 ways. One is setting examples. When I was involved in changing the British abortion law, and I've had a knocked-off effect in India, in Singapore, and things like that, which was very satisfying. And then in making DFID, I think, should give much more emphasis to family planning, and we should give much more money. And we also got to have a sense of proportion. I'm an Englishman lives in America because that's where the leadership was in the 70s and 80s in family planning. America, at its most generous, was spending per US citizen the cost of 1 hamburger per year on international family planning. So this is a minuscule part of any big budget. I came across a study recently by the World Bank about the pirates in Somalia. And in 2011, the World Bank calculated that the pirates cost the international community we let $12 billion, because you had to put ships around the Cape, you had to put frigates there, you know, it's very expensive having failed states. So I think we've got to raise our goals. For girls' education in Africa, it's going to be a multi-billion-dollar business. But America spends $2 billion every day on defense. And I think there's a very close link between peace in Africa, giving women autonomy, raising the age of marriage, slowing population growth, and the defense community is seeing that. But what we're doing at present is not commensurate with the scale of the threat. But the money we need to put into it is not going to put up our taxes. It's not going to be noticed in the big taxes that the developed country has. We need to put that money, and we need to have leaders in public health that are interested in this. I was a pioneer in AIDS prevention in Africa. I had the first USAID money for AIDS prevention in Africa. And looking back on it, I think in those self-sustaining heterosexual epidemics, it didn't make any difference to their progress. I thought I was so clever. I had $35 million for 3 years to swim AIDS in Africa. It was totally not commensurate with what we now know about that disease. What we're doing now in family planning, if we get $35 million, which I don't see happening, in family planning, it would not be commensurate with the scale of the problem. And so we've got to get that in front of politicians, and I think in front of the defense community. Because this is a defense issue, and you know, the defense community don't normally have much to do with public health people, but they are intelligent people, and they don't want wars, and they are seeing that there is a link here. And if we could get, you know, our Minister of Defense to say to the Minister of Defense of Nigeria, look, fellow Minister of Defense, if you don't tell the finance minister what money in family planning, you're really going to have a tough problem. Those are the kind of links which I think, you know, we should be looking for.
Should we take just another couple of questions? Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Malcolm, I always have a problem with elevate need, how it's measured in West Africa. Having worked there and being from there, women hide from their in-laws to get family planning. They hide from their husband, yes, even from their own children. Yes. They don't disclose to a researcher they don't know who came for the DHS. Yes. And this has always been ongoing because they're hiding, and I always think that they might be underreporting. How do we go about that issue? Because it's a problem in many of the Sahel countries, showing very low prevalence.
Yeah. I would like to live in a world where men and women have some equality and they can discuss family planning and make a joint decision. But I'm also very realistic and would help any woman who wants to keep it secret from her husband to keep it secret. And so I think, again, that's one of the strengths of the injectable contraceptives. In Ethiopia, women are very savvy. They have the freedom to go to the market, and they want to get the money for an injection from their husband, but their husband doesn't know they're using the injection. So they say, oh, my child's got worms, and the price of the worming medicine is about the same as the injectable contraceptive, and so they keep on getting injectable. Women are clever at navigating around obstructions. I wish those obstructions weren't there, but those of us who work in this field need to understand the obstructions, as you do so well, Radio, and find ways where, that's what I like about community-based distribution. There are people in Ethiopia, somebody in the village that knows how to give an injection. She knows which of her friends could tell her husband and which couldn't. And if the one that can't tell her husband comes around after dark and gets an injection, she'll give it to her. So when you push distribution of family planning out of clinics and into the society is self-regulating and will do a much better job. So going back to 1972 in Thailand, people were having 6 children. And my wonderful Thai friend, Vichai Viravadia, said, let's train people in villages to sell pills and condoms to their neighbours. And so I got in some money from the IPPF, and we got together about 60, quite the size of this audience here, in local medical office of health, about 3 hours outside Bangkok. And we were going to teach them in one day about the pill and about condoms. And we had the school teacher, the shop owner, the headman's wife, a selection of people from the village who we thought might be successful. And a telegram arrived from the Ministry of Health in Bangkok to Dr. Kong, the local medical officer of health. And this telegram said to Dr. Kong, do not cooperate with Kun Michai Virivadia and Dr. Malcolm Potts because they are breaking the law distributing the pill without a medical prescription. So this very nice doctor looked at this. He said, you know, in Thailand, telegrams can take 2 days to arrive. He says, I think this one's coming tomorrow. And in 6 months, we were so successful that the government changed the rules. But you have to sort of push and bend the rules. You cannot be politically correct in family planning. It's always going to be controversial because it's something to do with sex. And if you're to help vulnerable people, then you've got to see the world through their eyes. And the vulnerable people are often the women who are very unempowered. And we need to try and help them. And I agree with Radio. Sometimes our surveys don't necessarily tell us what's happening. But the community knows how to help itself. And that's what we really need to do. There is another way of helping people, and it's my colleagues here from DMI. I find there's very convincing evidence that the radio, which is the primary method of communication in Africa, can be very powerful in giving messages about contraception, about their safety, about later marriage, etc. And some very good random control trials have been done and are being done, and it is very, very low cost. It's also a very low cost way of saving dalis. What is it?
Somewhere between $1 and $10 per dali.
So just for public health, you know, to get $1 to $10 per dali is pretty good. And so mass media is very powerful, and that's somewhere where I put a lot of money. And again, a lot of money here is trivial in relation to, you know, a stealth fighter or an aircraft carrier. We have one less aircraft carrier, we have a lot more family planning money. So it's not hopeless, but it's challenging. It's very rewarding when you can do family planning and see it succeed. I can't think of anything as a doctor that is more rewarding than to see women becoming empowered, making decisions for themselves, no longer fearing being pregnant all the time, or whether there's the English women that I looked after in the Mary Stopes clinic a block away, or whether there's the women who are trying to help each other at the present level. And I remember sitting opposite a woman in the Mary Stopes clinic in the 1963 or something or other, and your young doctor said, how many children did you have? I think she said 3, and then you will say, how many abortions did you have? I think she said 13. And I was young and looked a bit surprised, which probably was inappropriate. And she said, it's my friend down the road, doctor, what syringes me out. Because the common way of doing safe abortions was with an enema syringe and squirting soap and water into the uterine cavity. Now, she'd had it 13 times and not died, and even got an infection, so she was lucky. But you know, that shows that in our own community, the pain and suffering and problems that people had only a generation ago to control their fertility. And really the young people in this room are the first generation that have almost total freedom, although I'd like to see the oral contraceptive sold in a vending machine. And I put cigarettes on prescription.
If we just take just one last, was there one last question?
I think I can probably speak.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to come back to this issue of implementation, and you mentioned talking to the politicians,
Yeah.
and that almost implied that you think what is needed is a top-down approach rather than something more bottom-up, or maybe something that's a bit complicated. And I wanted to ask more specifically about politics. So you also mentioned, you commended President Issoufou and how he has these sort of very ambitious goals. But he also came in 2011 and said he'd implement education reform, health reform, and now he's got a severe security crisis on his hands. He's up for re-election and all that's gone out the window. And really, if we talk about case studies from across the Sahel, which all have lots of similarities, how do we overcome that? How do we overcome the politics, and who should be leading on that?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that problems are solved at the community level. To get the resources and policy changes, we have to work at the top level, and that can be difficult. You get misunderstanding, but if we can, having spent 10 years of my life 24/7 trying to slow AIDS, I do realize that money changes policies. People were in denial about AIDS until there was a big cash flow, then everybody wanted to get into AIDS. All the doctors, all the ministers of finance, all the ministers of health. While there's a lot of money, let's be realistic about this as you can see. I think if we really had a big jump in family planning funding, whether people would say, I want that money, what policies do you want me to change? I'm a bit cynical about that, but money talks. The other thing is that in every society, however difficult the situation, however dismal it may seem, and this was how we started the education in Nigeria, there are always wonderful, exciting, vibrant people who will make a change. We've started what we call the Sahel Leadership Program. Nobody else has done this. It's very low cost. We have 200 applicants from Chad, Mali, Burkina, and Niger, from the government, from NGOs, from academia, from climate, from agriculture, from family planning, from education. We focused down on 28 that are sort of mid-career. We're mentoring them. We want to make that bigger next year. But supporting those, I've never been to a country that didn't have a small number of wonderful people who are your partners, who saw things in the same way and who wanted to make change. And again, that's, I think, part of the reward of any aspect of public health, is the people you meet who want to make change. And it's been a big part of my life that I can go to countries like Sri Lanka and meet people who wanted to make change, and I was able to provide a little bit of technical expertise or bring in a bit of money to meet China, which you wouldn't have otherwise have had and made a difference. But they're the people who are going to make the change, and they're the people who understand their community, who listen to their community. Because family planning is not telling people what to do, it's listening to what people want.
Right, I hope you will join me in thanking Professor Malcolm Potts for joining us today.